Um,
Oh.
Yay!
I will collect some health data of the residents in the building as well as the temperature records.
Yes, so will you look at just the temperature within buildings and then look at how this would impact occupants, or what do you think exactly?
Well, I will look into during which time still house the residents in the buildings. Otherwise, if the temperature is extremely high, it doesn't has zero impacts if the residents are not living in the buildings.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I think one important thing that we also kind of looked at is, of course, this would only work for past heat waves, but we would like to look at future heat waves as well, so kind of future projections. So that's one limitation maybe with if you look only at already observed data. But of course, one thing we also included later on is just to look at also when this heat actually affects occupants, like during what time slots. But yeah, any other ideas?
So you could look at different parts of the world. So like in the UK, we have, a range of heat. So you couldn't say, well, currently we have these set of health criteria, kind of issues with heat. But if we look in other parts of the world which are warmer, we can then infer that we would see a corresponding shift as opposed to just, turning everyone's heating up and cooking them.
Yeah, of course. I mean, yeah, the location is also very important. So what I will talk about in a bit is the UK itself, but of course it varies a lot even within the UK, how the different weather conditions are and how does that affect occupants.
By the way, Harriet Online says lack of sleep impacting health and work, and hospital admissions and stress on health systems as other indicators of impact of extreme heat.
Yeah, I mean, there's various different impacts for the occupants, which just kind of highlights why we think it's very important to look at. But thanks a lot for your ideas. I'll now show you how we did this. So how we approach this. I'll talk about our methodology for looking at the impact of heat on the UK occupants, and then the results that we gather from it. So two different types of results. So what I already kind of hinted at a bit, there's a lot of different factors that influence how extreme heat affects occupants, which we studied these 5 factors, which can also show to be of significant importance. So first of course, the building type itself. So are we looking at the flat, or are we looking at the housing type, and what kind of flat we're looking at? If it's ground to top floor flat, that's a big difference. And also for the different housing types, so kind of constructions the house has specifically. Then the second point, which I already hinted at a bit, is the location. So the urban heat island effect also impacts this a lot. So if your house is inside a very urban area or has a lot of green space around, this is a very important factor as well. Then looking more at the weather scenarios, so the heat wave duration, how long do we expect to be exposed to very extreme heat? Is it just the heat wave building up to the peak day, or is the hottest day expected to last for a few more days? This is also very important, as well as the year, of course. So are we looking at the current climate, or the climate projected to 2050 or 2080? And then finally, the occupant age is also essential because, for example, elderly have a restricted sweat rate, so they cannot cool themselves down as efficiently, which of course makes them overheat a lot faster. So we looked at all of these different factors and also combinations of them. And how we analyzed it is based on 3 main components. So first of all, we did building simulations, which means that we use different building constructions and weather scenarios, and then simulated the indoor conditions over the whole year for these combinations of building and weather data. Then what we looked at is, for the weather data, it's very important that we look at extreme scenarios. We're very interested, of course, in extreme heat waves and longer lasting heat waves. So we essentially created some extreme weather data ourselves. And then finally, for the assessment, we really want to know how these indoor conditions in buildings affect occupants themselves. So what kind of health impacts does it have on the occupants beyond mere the temperature that we can observe in the building? We really want to know the impacts. So
Can we ask questions during this talk or after?
Yeah, sure.
How do you create the extreme weather data?
I'll talk about it later, but yeah, we looked at this thermal comfort, and I'll now talk about all of these three components in a bit more detail. So starting off with the building simulation pipeline that we used. So essentially, I use different building types and different weather scenarios. And my pipeline just allowed me to run a lot of these combinations automatically. So for every building data that we have, so an input building is just one building construction that we use. We then first modified it, which essentially just specifies what kind of outputs we want to look at, so what kind of thermal comfort outputs we want to have, and some details for the simulations. And then these modified buildings we pair with every single weather scenario we want to look at and feed into this Energy Plus tool, which is a building energy modeling tool that's based on physical processes. So how, for example, air moves through the building or heat transfers within the building, calculates us some outputs of how the indoor conditions in the building are. It gives us hourly values for the whole year, for example, indoor temperature, humidity, and so on. And these Energy Plus outputs, we then post-process to give us our final thermal comfort outputs and also some visualizations. So again, the pipeline that I implemented here just allowed me to run a lot of combinations with the buildings and weather scenarios I want to look at. And I now want to talk a bit more about the inputs that we're using. So for the buildings, we have data, because we look at the UK, so we have data that's representative of 88% of the UK housing stock. And for the weather scenario, which is again quite important what kind of weather scenarios we want to look at, we use three main types of weather scenarios. So first of all, we look at historical years. So for this, we look at historical data for how would a typical year in the current climate look like, and also historical heat waves. In our case, we use that 2022 heat wave. And this historical data is of course observed, so there's not a lot of uncertainty associated with it. We have measured data for these events. And then we also want to look at future data, so projected years in the future. So what would a typical weather look like in 2030 or 50? And then, of course, also future heat waves. So this is for future typical years, there's widely data available. So based on some climate projections for the future, but these future heat waves is one of the kind of weather data we created ourselves because the data for this is not really available online. And then I also implemented some extensions, which is the last type of weather data I want to talk about. So again, we're interested in prolonged heat waves. So due to climate change, we also expect heat waves to become longer lasting. So that's why we implement an algorithm that kind of prolongs the heat waves, and we can assess this impact on buildings as well. And then we incorporate this urban heat island effect. I want to point out here that with future heat waves and or future weather data overall and these extensions, there's a lot of uncertainty associated with it, because as we all know, it's already hard to know what the weather will look like in the next maybe 2 or 3 days. So it's hard to know exactly what would it look like in 2050 or so on. So what we did is kind of just make some assumptions, which you just have to do, and do some reasonable assumptions of how we think these weather scenarios would look like. And based on this, we created these three types of extreme weather data, which first of all include these future heat waves. So for the future heat waves, what we did is we used three types of weather files that we have, which are historically typical years, historical heat wave data, and these projections for future typical years. And we then created this future heat waves. And for this, we assumed that the impact that historically a heat wave has had on the typical conditions is comparable to the impact that a future heat wave would have to like the weather variables of a future typical year. So in one of these weather files, we have a lot of different weather variables. And for each weather variable, so here it is shown for temperature, we compute the hourly difference between the historical heat wave and the historically typical year, and then just add this exact difference to the future projected typical year to give us a future heat wave. And again, we do this for all the weather variables. And this then gives us an estimation of a future heat wave. Then for extending a heat wave file we just look at the heat wave, we identify the hottest state within the heat wave, and essentially just replicate it to last a few more days. So we did this for 3, 5, and 7 days in our case. And so we just, again, we replicate all the weather data for this one kind of peak heat wave day and make it longer lasting. And finally, for this urban heat island effect, we just shift the temperature up by the expected urban heat island intensity. So if we assume that in a city it's on average 2 degrees warmer over the summer compared to the rural surroundings, we just shift up the whole temperature by 2 degrees. And this gives us again some kind of estimation of how this would look like, and we can use this weather scenario with the incorporated urban heat island effect to look at what kind of impact it would have on buildings. So these are the kind of weather scenarios we look at, and I also talked about my simulation pipeline before. The last thing about my methodology that I want to show are now how we kind of analyze the outputs, because again, that's very important for our overall results. So first off, what has been historically done, or mostly in these building simulation studies, is to look at thermal comfort. So how do indoor conditions feel like to a person? How comfortable would someone feel within the building? So there's a lot of different models that are used, and 5 of them I put on here, which are temperature, humidex, standard effective temperature, the so-called web-alt globe temperature, and predicted mean vote. And we decided to study all of these 5 models because there's different standards and they define different models to use. So it's hard to know which one is the best one, especially for extreme conditions. So we decided to just implement kind of a range of them and compare them to each other as well. I'll talk about the first 3 in a bit more detail later when I show the results. That's why they're in bold here. But one problem that's kind of with them is because they assess comfort within buildings, but we're interested in extreme heat. So we kind of want to go beyond mere comfort, but what are the health implications for humans? More recent research has looked at the livability within buildings. So within buildings are also outdoor spaces. So if we have extreme conditions, how much activity could an occupant still do in the environment? So could this person still run around or have only be able to walk? And also they did this for different age groups, because there's of course varying kind of resilience to heat based on your age. And that's also something that's missing from thermal comfort models, which usually just give you a value for how an average person would feel in an environment. So again, we looked at these safe sustained activities and also survivability limits. And then finally, we introduce a novel metric, which we call activity hours, which is then kind of allows you to quantify the livability during heat waves based on factors like occupant age, the temperature, humidity, your activity level, and also exposure duration. So I'll talk about this when I show you the results in a moment. But I'll start with the thermal comfort results from our analysis. So what I want to show you now is the observed indoor thermal comfort during a heat wave in a typical UK semi-detached house. So semi-detached houses are the most common housing type in the UK. And for anyone who's not familiar with it, it's just a house that has kind of shares one wall with another house next to it. And what you can see here is the standard effective temperature over 7 days for 5 different weather scenarios. So the so-called SAT is just a thermal comfort matrix, which includes the 6 main factors of thermal comfort, which are kind of both personal and environmental. So it uses the clothing level someone wears and also the anticipated activity level this person has, as well as temperature, humidity, radiant temperature, and also kind of air velocity, so how much air speed you have. And it shows this, and what we can see here is, again, 5 weather scenarios. We look at the historically typical year, which is this green line. We look at the 2020 heat wave, Then we look at the 2022 heat wave that we expanded to last the whole week, so where the hottest day was replicated to last the whole week. Then we look at the 2050 typical year, which is here called 2050 RCP 4.5, based on some moderate climate change projections, and then also 2050 heat wave. And you can also see that at there's one kind of dotted line at the 30 Z degrees, which just indicates the thermal comfort threshold. So beyond this, we consider the conditions to not be comfortable anymore to an occupant. And there's now two things I want to point out here. That first of all, we can see that there's very high discomfort during longer lasting and future heat waves, which are this red and blue line, where we can see the conditions over the whole week are always very close to the threshold line or even beyond. And the second point I want to make is that there's also a significant increase in discomfort compared to historically typical conditions. So compared to this green line, we can see that the discomfort is quite a bit higher for all the other weather scenarios. And we cross this line more often for the other weather scenarios. And we also, as I mentioned before, did this analysis not only for SET, but for example, also for temperature and the humidex, where humidex is just a model that includes temperature and humidity to give you a value of how an average person would feel like in the environment. And this also already gives us quite some interesting insights in how different weather scenarios affect a particular building. But as I already told you a few times, I model a lot of different buildings, a lot of different weather scenarios, and I want to kind of directly be able to compare them to each other. And creating one of these plots is kind of challenging to be able to compare them efficiently to each other. So what we would essentially like is to be able to kind of quantify this discomfort over the heat wave week, which is why we then use the so-called degree hours, which exactly allows you to do that. So we look at the hottest week, so this heat wave week, and every time that for a particular weather scenario and building, we cross this the threshold, we add up the difference between the observed value and the threshold. So we calculate this difference and add it up over the whole heat wave week, which gives us a measure of how often we are in the discomfortable range, but also by how much. So, and it gives you one single value for every combination of building and weather scenario. So we did this for all the different combinations that we simulated, and we can now compare them to each other by using one single value for kind of every building and weather data combination. What I want to show you now is exactly this, which we did for SET degree hours. And in this plot, you can see three different types of flats that I want to compare to each other. So ground, mid, and top floor flats. On the y-axis, these SET hours that we calculated over the heat wave week. We can see that here the green bars show a historically typical year. So for the hottest week in this historically typical climate conditions, how many SET hours we could observe in these three types of flats. And we can see that it still seems to be very comfortable. So in a ground floor flat, we never even crossed this comfort threshold. And also for mid and top floor flats, the SET hours are not as high. So we're mostly comfortable within the building. However, when we now compare this to a 2022 heat wave, we can see that in upper floor flats, we already have roughly 200 SET hours, which means that because during 1 week we have around 170 hours, we will be on average 1 degree above the threshold, which already indicates quite a bit of discomfort within these upper floor flats. But the ground floor flat is still very resilient to heat. So this already indicates that the difference of ground floor flats being way more resilient to heat than upper floor flats. If we now compare this to an extended heat wave, so if we make a heat wave longer lasting, we can see that there's a significant increase in the SET hours. So we can see maybe 700 SET hours over a whole week, which is quite significant, and even more so for a 2050 heat wave. So this allows us to directly compare different building types to each other. So we've seen ground floor flats are way more resilient to heat than upper floor flats, and also comparing the different weather scenarios to each other. And we also did this then for other UK housing types, so for different housing, not only flats, but also different housing types, which you can see here. But I don't really want to go into that in too much detail. What I want to point out now is that, again, it gives us some insight, but it's hard to assess what this essentially means for the occupants itself, because especially during the extreme conditions, so the extended, so longer lasting and future heat waves, we just get a very high number of set hours, but we don't know what this means for occupants. So that's why we decided to look into livability a bit more, and I want to talk about these results right now. So how we assess livability is basically in the following way. So here again, we look at a semi-detached house, so a single house, and elderly population groups, so people over 65 years. And on the left-hand side, you can see a plot that shows on the x-axis the temperature, and on the y-axis the relative humidity. And within the plot, for every combination of temperature and humidity, we show kind of the degree, the level of activity an occupant, so in this case an elderly, could still do in these conditions. So in this case, the lighter gray bars would indicate that an elderly person could still do moderate to vigorous physical activities. So you could still walk around the house, do all the household chores, for example. But these two dark gray bars indicate that an occupant would be restricted to light physical activities. This means that you could only walk around very slowly in the house, maybe do the dishes, but nothing more exhausting to you. So it's already quite restrictive. Then as soon as you cross the livability line, this yellowish area would mean that an elderly person can only lie down without any clothes and stay hydrated, but not move at all. So it's still still survivable, but obviously not livable anymore. And then there's this quite harsh livability line. And what we now did is that we looked at the indoor conditions during these heat waves and plotted the hourly values on kind of this plot, such that we could see what kind of activities are still possible during these situations inside for different housing types. So not sure if you spotted it, but there's already one single dot on here, which probably you didn't see, which represents 1 hour for a 2022 heat wave. So the conditions during 1 hour, so we would have around 45% relative humidity and maybe 27 degrees in this hour. And we could still do, our elderly could still do moderate physical activities. But that's, of course, only 1 hour. We now want to look at all the hours over the hottest week, which should look like this. And I maybe should point out that we're looking at daytime hours here. So we only consider 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. because during the night we wouldn't really do anything anyways. And here we can see that at least during 1 hour, elderly would already be restricted to only light physical activities. So they would already have to be a bit careful. But this is, of course, just for a 2022 heat wave in this particular building for elderly. We now also want to look at future heat waves, so for example, 2030. We can see that here the conditions already shift a bit closer to the livability limits. So elderly would be more and more restricted of how much they can do within their building. And if we go now one step further and look at how a heat wave in 2050 would impact occupants, we can see that this is even more pronounced. And for 1 hour within the hottest week, elderly would already be like on this livability line, meaning they couldn't move anymore, they couldn't do anything anymore in their building. And this is for a semi-detached house, which is even one of the more resilient housing types, and we haven't included anything like the urban heat island effect yet. So this gives us a more direct kind of approach of assessing how extreme heat impacts humans. But again, we have a similar kind of problem as before, that producing these plots takes quite some time, and also it's not that easy to compare different buildings and weather scenarios to each other. So what we would like to have is something similar to these degree hours that allows you to quantify the livability over time. So this is exactly why we then define the activity hours, which allows you to quantify the indoor livability during these heat waves. So what we do for this is we count the number of hours that your conditions lie within a different these different ranges of livability. So the number of hours that an occupant could still do some sort of physical activity during daytime. And we did this for both young population groups and elderly. So essentially, maybe we go back to this, we defined 4 different ranges of activity. Either you could still do moderate to vigorous activities. We count the number of hours, or the number of points that fall within this range. Then we count the number of points that fall within the light physical activities, the number of hours that are not livable anymore, and the ones that are not survivable anymore. And this then gives you kind of one of these vectors, where you can see the hours and the safe sustained activities for every single weather scenario of building. And with this metric, we kind of have an intuitive metric for the indoor livability that the heat wave that considers both the occupant age, but also main environmental factors such as humidity and temperature, your possible activity levels, and also how long you're exposed to these severe conditions. So we did this analysis now for the UK then, and I'll talk about the results of this in a bit more detail and how we make the results that we have also available. But this was kind of the whole methodology that we use of how we simulated the buildings and analyzed the results. And while we were working on this, so I was again doing this for the UK. Because we had the data available for the UK, we were thinking that we created this whole simulation pipeline and this methodology. It would be great to make it available for anyone to use for also other locations. So that's why we then decided to implement this so-called Heatalyzer tool. So this tool allows you to do the same kind of evaluation for various different locations. And we wrote a paper on this, which if you want to, you can have a look at, but I'll also be happy to share the link later on with anyone interested. And also we made the code available online, which you could have a look at with this GitHub link. Again, it just makes our methodology available to anyone to use. And I want to point out a few things or show you a few snippets of how the tool looks like when you actually use it. So there's 3 main sections in the tool. So the first one is to kind of upload your files. As you may remember from my simulation pipeline, the first step was just the input. So you have these building data and the weather data. And this is also what you would upload here, kind of building data, weather data. Then you can make some specifications for the outputs later on and just click on simulate, and then that's my simulation for you. I would also analyze, kind of provide you then with the outputs. Then a second step related to like the weather data is we include functionalities to create these extreme weather data that I talked about. So these algorithms that I implemented, I made them available such that you could just, for example, for a prolonged heat wave, upload your heat wave that you have, select how long you want the heat wave to be extended for, and then it generates this for you, and you can download the new weather file. And then finally, when you did the simulation with the building data and weather data you want, you can look at the results. So this would, for example, would be one type of result, similar to the one I showed you before, the 5 thermal comfort models that we report over the 3 hottest. So the hottest week with the preceding and following week are shown 4 different building types. So you could select the building type, you can select what kind of result you want, and even the building zone, and it will show you this result. And then also we implemented in this Healyzer also this livability assessment that I showed you, which should show you what kind of activities are still possible for a particular occupant, as well as these activity hours. I also added them now that we define. Yeah, so please feel free to play around with it for anyone interested, and also give me some feedback. But what we did is we ran this analysis, of course, with the UK, as I already mentioned a few times, and especially the livability results, we thought because we ran all of these simulations for these housing types that are representative of the UK, it would be great to make them available online for anyone to look at, so that anyone in the UK could just select their specific housing type and their where it's located, their age, etc., and kind of find out on the different future or current heatwave scenarios how affected they are. So this is why we then, based on our tool, created this Heatalyzer dashboard, which currently allows you to assess the livability during heat waves in London. So what we report there are the results from the Heatalyzer tool for both the set degree hours that I talked about and our activity hours. And actually, I think I have time to give a quick, if this works, a quick demo of this. Should I do it right now?
Change the share screen.
Yeah, I think that should. I hope I can show it quickly. Yes. I'm not sure if I can. Okay, yes, so essentially what you could do here is, I'll move this up. You have different selections, so you can choose the building type, which would be ground, mid, top floor flats, like all these different housing types that overall represent the UK housing stock. So we can, for example, select this mid floor flat, then you can choose your location. So if you're very central, so you have a lot of this urban heat island effect, or you have a lot of green space around, you can just select these options then and what kind of heat wave you're interested in. So are you interested in a typical year? So this would be no heat wave, or interested in a heat wave which you expect to last for 3 days and so on. And then also of course the years of current climate or 2030, 2050 and so on. And for the year you choose, you will get the following output. So these least passive survivability means that we look at the set hours. So you can see for this particular scenario, we would expect to have 500 of these set degree hours over 1 week. And then also the activity hours that I'll talk about for younger populations and elderly. So you can see for young from 80 to 45 or over 65 years old, how many hours during daytime you would still be able to do what kind of activity levels. I maybe should point out here, because you can see that one of the things we're currently restricted to is that younger and elderly population, there's kind of a gap from 40 to 65 where we don't have any data because it's based on another study. Yeah, but this would be one thing to work on in the future. But yeah, this just allows you to do this for London. And what we also would really like to do is, or I'm currently working on, is running it for different climate zones within the UK, so that anyone within the UK could choose their closest city and then look at the outputs for their location. But I'll now go back to the presentation. Okay, yes, so this was the Heatalyzer dashboard, and also we would like to make maybe more of the outputs that we did from the tool available online there in the longer term. And yeah, this was the main things I worked on during my last 6 months. I now want to quickly also talk about future work that we would we hope to continue with this. So first of all, using my Heatalyzer tool, of course, it will be super interesting to do the same kind of analysis that we did for the UK for different locations across the world, across Europe and also across the world. So we could identify, look at the representative housing stocks of different countries and do the same kind of analysis. And even more so, maybe even create a map based on the local housing characteristics that identifies what kind of housing types you have and then directly can associate with your risk level to extreme heat. This is one thing that would be very interesting. And another thing is, with the tool that I have, like this Heatylizer, we could also evaluate the effectiveness of different mitigation strategies. So for example, just if you would shade windows, what kind of impact would this have during the heat waves? which would be very immediate solutions, but also if it's installing air conditioners, what kind of difference would that make? Or longer term, you could also, of course, improve the insulation or put some reflective painting on the walls or the roofs, which would help during heat waves. Yeah.
Are these mitigation strategies all things that you could model in Energy Plus?
I think, for example, a lot of them are possible. I haven't looked into it that much, but for example, reflective paintings would be very easy to model because in Energy Plus you have very detailed housing construction. So there's a lot of information on how the housing is constructed also on the in the walls, or so you could just tweak different parameters and kind of reflect how this would be represented by the different things you want to look at. So I think most of them will be possible. I'm not sure about like natural ventilation, how easy it is to include certain things, but or like the adaptive measures of humans will be probably quite challenging to model in Energy Plus because it's more concentrated on the buildings. But I think there's a lot of things you could implement and try out. Yeah, so these are things that we would be interested in looking at and also incorporating in the tool. But yes, if you have any maybe feedback on what I just talked about or recommendations or other ideas, I would be very happy to hear them as well. Also on the activity hours that we just now kind of newly defined. But other than that, I'm very happy to answer any questions about this. And yeah, thanks again for coming.
Okay, maybe I'll start with the question from online. Harriet, who says, a really interesting presentation, excellent work, the clarification. Is all the analysis daytime oriented? If so, what is the potential under or overestimates given the importance of nighttime?
So not all the analysis is daytime oriented. So the thermocomfort results were all for kind of a whole week. So the maximum, for example, degree hours over some week within the year. But we now decided for the livability assessment to focus on the daytime because we just made the assumption that during the nighttime you would sleep anyways. So, and during the nighttime, the impacts are usually, so it's not as hot as during the daytime, so the impacts would be less severe, and you wouldn't want to run around usually anyway. So we wanted to focus on daytime. This was just kind of some assumption that we made right now, because at first we actually started with looking at the whole week, but we also identified when I now took out the nighttime hours, it usually just takes away from hours where you can do moderate to rigorous physical activity. So it just gives you more of a value where we're actually interested in.
I think there's some impact from losing sleep over your ability to then survive the your ability long term to do productive work during daylight hours. It's impacted by your inability to sleep. Surely.
Yeah, that's true. So
it's really helpful, Livia. I think it's just really interesting and what you've been able to do in such a short time.
Thank you. Yeah, any questions in the room? And then Ruchi, you can unmute yourself afterwards. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm curious about the building data that you used for the UK. So can you say a bit more like how many houses you have, which archetypes did you use all the main archetypes to cover 80% of the UK, or yeah, maybe just give us.
Yeah, so we got data which was developed by kind of the UK government for some, they call it code study, cost optimal domestic electrification. So they developed these archetypes for different study where they did a detailed analysis of the UK housing stock and kind of based on that defined different archetypes that would in total cover most of the UK housing stock, which I then have, again, I said it's like 88% according to them. And what they include are basically 12 different archetypes, the 3 flats I showed, and then 9 different housing types, which were mid-terraced houses and end-terraced houses, semi-detached houses, detached houses, and also bungalows. And also for the different housing types, we have some with cavity walls, which means insulated walls, but solid, and also solid walls. So we were also able to compare how do housing types with solid walls compare to housing types with more recent houses with well insulated walls. So these were the main building types that we used, which we got access to, but essentially it was 12 different archetypes that we got and looked at them with the different weather scenarios.
Okay, and then for each archetype, you have a lot of different real world data that you can use to model it, or do they have like a model for each archetype?
It's one model for like one building type. And what you could do, I currently just looked at kind of the basis construction of each of these, but they also implemented options that you could, for example, already with their archetypes that they have, model different windows. So if you have, instead of double glazed, triple glazed insulation, so they already give you some options of retrofitting measures, which would be some kind of very archetypes, but it's just one archetype, another real world building. It should just be representative of these types of buildings, essentially.
Let's go to an online question. Ruchi, could you just ask yourself, just unmute yourself and ask, please.
Yes, thanks, Livia. So I just had a question regarding assumptions in your modeling with respect to orientation and with respect to air changes per hour, or how the space is ventilated. So
Sorry,
what were the inputs with respect to orientation?
yeah, with respect to orientation, they were as the buildings, we did not change anything there. So as far as I know, they were just oriented in the basis, I think towards like north oriented. But I know this would be another thing that would be interesting to look at, and another probably very important factor to study, because I've also read through a literature review that the orientation has quite some impact. So of course, this would be another point to look at to kind of change the orientation of the buildings and see what kind of impact that has. But we didn't currently look at that, so we just used the standard orientation that the housing types had.
Okay, and what about the air changes per hour for ventilation and infiltration? What were the inputs there?
So when we're now looking at natural ventilatability, so there's no air conditioning installed in these types of buildings.
Yeah, but you would have had to input some air changes per hour, right? For ventilation rate and for infiltration as well.
It's the defaults, I guess.
I used the default, I didn't change
Okay.
anything about, so I'm actually not.
Yeah. Actually, yes. So these would be 2 points that would be interesting to take forward, because they are the most impactful with respect to release of heat from buildings.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Is there anything else in the room? Yeah, Orlando?
You talked about kind of young and old with these broad groups. Just curious, is there much effect of gender, or like how much more granular can you get between?
Actually, I think there is some effect on gender. However, we didn't look at this right now. We used the studies which actually is based on women. So the livability assessments you can see are for women. But I've read that, yeah, there's also a slight difference, but of course, I think the age difference is way more important than the gender difference. But again, it will also be interesting to have more refined livability estimates, especially because there's currently one age group that's completely missing.
Yeah.
But we again just use what was available at the moment, and it's also these livability ranges that we're using is very recent research, so it was just released in 2023. So last year, I think October or so, the study. So hopefully in kind of the coming months or years, there's more work also being done on that, so you could refine this analysis.
Okay, let's go with another online question. Robert, if you could please ask a question. Okay, maybe I'll ask on your, so Robert says, is there a web page showing your results and research to date?
So there's this Heatscore dashboard, which I had one link here, which shows you the livability results that we have for London. And I have the Healyzer tool online, which also shows kind of some of the results. This, I would say this is the main thing, but I don't have personally now a web page where we're also gonna do a second, I think right now, a second paper on what we've been working on. So the main thing is the Healyzer tool, the dashboard that I have, and kind of these papers that we wrote on it, which is the main thing where we have occurred.
I think that's future work to put a website together.
Yeah,
It's
I'm
not of
sure.
interest, obviously. Okay,
Yeah.
so let's go to another question in the groups. Yeah, we have.
So you mentioned that you use like 30° as a threshold to define extremely hot weather. This might hold true in UK, but let's say in other places in Europe, let's say in southern Italy or Sicily Island, 30° might be very common in the summer. So how do you define, like, is this the absolute temperature that causes the discomfort of people, or the variation of the temperature within given time that causes the discomfort of the people?
So essentially why we use this 30 set degrees is because it's used in standards like in the US, where they define kind of this passive survivability in buildings. So it's, but of course, and also for sand, it's not pure temperature. It includes different factors such as the humidity, etc. But of course, it's also, that's why these thermal comfort models are a bit difficult to use, because it's also different people are used to different, as you kind of said, different temperatures, and it's one kind of a bit arbitrarily defined threshold again. So again, that's why we think kind of it's more interesting to look at livability, and also gives you a more, like, a better assessment of the impacts of extreme heat on occupants.
I think it's fair to say that people do get accustomed to heat.
Yeah.
So there is a learned effect, and so it's expected that people live in hot conditions, for them 30 degrees may not seem very hot at all. The livability research and so on doesn't take that into account. So there is still something that needs to be done. But I would assume that all these bars get shifted to the right when we talk about people who are acclimated to hot weather conditions, and that would be something that we don't really, that's something that the livability researchers would give us as input to our work here. Let me go online again. So Andrea, maybe you could ask a question, just unmute yourself.
Yes, great presentation and tool, Olivia. I just wanted to know a little more about how Heatalyzer is accounting for uncertainties in your future climate predictions, and also does it predict changes in the intensity of the urban heat index effect, or is the 1 to 2 degree increase fixed in this scenario? Thanks.
Yeah, so first of all, for the urban heat island effect, so for my study, I just used 1 or 2 degrees, but the Healyzer tool allows you to create these weather files yourself, so you can essentially put in any urban heat island intensity you're interested in. So you can also put in 1.5 degrees or 0.5 degrees, create your weather file and put it into the Healyzer tool, and then run the same kind of analysis. So that's not fixed. And for the other uncertainties associated with the weather scenarios, again, we just made some assumptions here. So the Healyzer tool just takes in the weather data you give it, and the building data, and gives you the outputs. So to cope with the uncertainty of weather scenarios, how we do this kind of is just to run a lot of different weather scenarios and combinations. And maybe one thing we also thought could be interesting to incorporate different ways of creating, for example, future heat waves or future weather data into our Healyzer tool to allow you to assess even more on different weather scenarios, because I think the best way is to just look at different scenarios, because there's uncertainty associated with all of them. But again, that would be for future work as well, to incorporate all of these into the tool.
Okay, somebody in the room? Yeah.
In your graphs, I guess it was one thing I was slightly confused about was the graph for 2022 heat wave plus 2022 plus 7 didn't start in the same place. I could have, if you're extending the heat wave, I guess why didn't they?
You mean
Yeah, if you're, yeah,
here? Oh, so it's,
or in the next slide, I think.
you mean, I think it's just,
Yes,
you mean here?
yeah, so kind of like, in my mind, the
Yeah.
kind of first day for pretty plus 7 would have been the same.
Yeah, exactly. So it would be, but we it was before like that. But what we show here is the hottest week. So this is why for every weather scenario, but we identify which one was the hottest week and show the hottest week here. So essentially, this red line would actually start here. So at day 7, but it's now shifted back because we want to compare the different hottest weeks to each other.
Okay.
Does this make sense?
Yes, I think it's kind of it's slightly confusing. Can I see where in the hottest week is not the same stuff?
Because all heat waves typically end with the rainfall and the sharp drop in temperatures.
Right.
So the hottest week is not does not necessarily include the hottest day. It's a subtle point, but we ran across this, so we had to make this decision. It's too difficult to explain in the talk. But
Yeah, it's just slightly.
but excellent catch. I mean, that's exactly what's going on. Okay, we have one more. Harriet, would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I really like this work, and I can speak offline as to something the EU is doing in terms of localized impact and projections, to which this speaks really nicely to. I was just really thinking about the ability to identify areas and housing types that are most at risk to non-survivability days. So have you run a sort of a simulation to find that those that appear, given the parameters of this work, most at risk?
So what we've been doing is purely, as I said, kind of the livability or survivability for these different housing types. So currently you could look at, or what you can observe if you look at the climate for 2080 and specific housing types, that for elderly you get into the zone where you have some hours that are not survivable anymore. But this is essentially where we kind of ended, and of course, in future work it would be interesting to run this more and look at also identifying different specific houses that would be vulnerable. But as of what we have now is just different housing types, and you could choose different weather scenarios and then see if you would land into this range that's not survivable anymore. Which currently, if I remember correctly, only happens for 2080 for the most vulnerable housing types.
Thank you.
Okay, any other last question from the room? Okay, I think we're done. Thank you very much, Divya.